Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anindita, and I'm going to be taking you through this session today where we speak about the guidelines for front-end teams working on SItecore sites as such. So why do we need to talk about this? Up front here, I am actually a backend developer. I don't have extensive experience working, doing full-on front-end development as such, but I have worked on several SItecore projects where we've had a lot of front-end teams with varying levels of experience in working with SItecore. So based on that experience, we've kind of collated this information together. This is especially helpful in greenfield projects, but it is also going to be most helpful in situations where the front-end team is new on working with SItecore. And this would also be helpful to seasoned backend developers as such to streamline the collaboration process between the front-end and backend teams. So while SItecore as such does not impose any restrictions on the HTML, there are certain best practices which when followed, it will make the integration of backend components with the HTML much smoother. And it would enable the backend SItecore developers to follow best standards as well seamlessly. The front-end team can simply deliver the HTML and front-end assets as is expected for any website development and adhere by the guidelines that we have entailed here. And following these pointers should make for a seamless experience even for front-end team which has no prior experience with SItecore. We're also going to go over the concerns to address and identify. First of all, obviously, you want to identify the concerns, know what kind of concerns are actually need to be addressed, and address these in advance, different ways in which you would want to address them. And this would help in saving the time by reducing the amount of collaboration time required between the front-end team and back-end team. And it would also help in reducing the overall development time as such. Now, some of these things that I speak about, they might seem a little trivial to experienced SItecore developers, but it is certainly helpful in streamlining the process, as I mentioned, and it will surely add value while collaborating with front-end teams. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to speak about is page layouts. Now, vanilla SItecore as such has a very component-based architecture. So the first thing you'd want to do when you receive the designs, and this is something that probably a business analyst or a tech lead or even a front-end lead based on the structure of your team and the process being followed within your project. So this is something that should definitely be done as the first thing when you receive your designs, be it in a whole chunk or as designs trickling through. So what you would want to do is kind of figure out the page layouts. So in the example that I've shown here, we have divided the page into three big blocks, being the top, the middle, and the bottom. So these would essentially transform into placeholders, being the top, the middle, and the bottom placeholders. And that would be the location where you would just drop in components one after another. So let's look at some more examples of how you would create page layouts. So the previous case that we saw, it was just a one-column page layout. So an example here is of a two-column page layout where we have the top, the middle, and the bottom chunks. But inside that, we have also identified that the page is divided into a two-column format. So we have a left and right sidebar, additional placeholders being added. And the next image that you see here is basically an example showing that multiple page layouts can be used in tandem and can be also repeated on a page to break down your page or break down your design. Now, this kind of breakdown is probably not something you will see in your real pages because for user experience sake, but this is just to kind of make a point. So in this case, you can see that the two-column left sidebar has been used a couple of times in different positions on the page itself. From a front-end perspective, the main thing to keep in mind here is that the page layout, each page layout should correspond to a common and a fixed outer tag, basically, an outer wrapper tag with whatever classes and attributes that it needs. So in this case, a two-column left sidebar should ideally be should be a common wrapper tag that I have, and in that I will put up, in that I will put the left and right placeholders and stuff like that. But that outer tag should be common and in any page, when I place it in any page, in any position, it should actually divide the page into this two-column structure that I'm looking for. So that being said, there might be certain exceptions that you need to account for. So even in the screenshot, you can see that this two-column left sidebar, based on the position, if it is at the bottom of the page, you might need some added padding. So when stuff like this happens, things like this can definitely be accounted for. And from a backend perspective, this would be done using rendering parameters. And from a front end perspective, you'll want to make sure that inconsistencies like this can be accounted for with minimal front end changes, with, be it just by toggling a class or, an attribute and stuff like that. So that is something that the backend team can also easily account for. Now, if it is something more complicated and it's like you're drastically changing the HTML, there's really no point trying to, probably a better idea would be in that case to just create a separate page layout for whatever reason. Yeah. But these exceptions can definitely be handled from a backend and front-end perspective gracefully. A tip over here for front-end teams is that it's a good idea to add comments for conditional code and configurable styles like this, or classes that can be toggled to result in different styles and stuff like this that we discussed. So as a backend developer, when I receive this, the markup, I have already documented a list of configurations that I need to account for as rendering parameters or whatever be the case in SItecore. So it's a good idea to kind of put that up front in the HTML itself. That will also help in reducing the amount of back and forth time. So moving on, the next point would be to identify reused components. So in this example that we saw, all the stuff which is outlined in the yellow borders, those are ideally components. Now, identifying components is a very subjective process as such, because it depends on the process and the content, or rather the context that the content provides. So this is ideally something a business analyst or a tech lead together would do, and that's something that would be identified before the development begins. So it surely must be done in advance. Now you need to, so in this case, we're talking about reused components. So when you get the designs, you would want to determine if a particular component can be reused or not. And while deciding this, there needs to be a balance between kind of managing configurations for component reuse and keeping things simple, because you want to mark certain components as reuse only if there are only if this can be handled using, again, minimal HTML changes such as just toggling a class and stuff like that, because you don't want to overcomplicate it, you don't want to over engineer things. Keep in mind that it's quite tempting, I believe, to okay, let's keep things simple and super simple and create components for everything. You don't want to do that either, because every component you add, it adds on a lot of time, not just for development and not just for the amount of time it's taking you to copy paste the component, but it's adding on time from project management, from business analyst time, for tickets and stuff like that, for front end, back end, QA, documentation, content author training, everything. So the time does pile on. But that being said, overcomplicating components is also a really bad idea, because that's going to make your code less maintainable, and it will definitely add on a lot of time and confusion for QA and content author training as well. A tip here is to document your components, and this is probably something, again, based on your team structure. This might be this ideally would be a task that would be taken up by the same entity who is determining the reuse of components. So ideally, it would be a shared document. I'm not talking about a very elaborate document here. It just needs to be sort of a lookup document where you have the name of the component and a screenshot, a pictorial representation. That's it. So if you have this sort of lookup available, it usually turns out extremely useful. So not just for the business analyst who's trying to determine the reuse components, but also to backend developers, as in we know that, okay, fine, this is a reuse, so I just need to do it as a variant. It's a quick lookup for me as well. It helps the front end team, the QA, and content author training, everything. And this document can also serve as as a base for or a starting point for content author training guides, in case that's also available, a part of your deliverables. So it's this is something I found really useful. And another point to mention here also is that these components are identified usually initially, and it goes through a lot of teams as such, as in you have one person or a set of teams kind of documenting the tickets, and then you have someone doing the front end, someone doing the back end. So the naming of the component, I've seen a lot of confusions arise in with the naming of the components, because everybody, obviously, it's personal preference, people name it how they like. So if this is decided early on, it helps in saving a lot of collaboration time and also helps in saving a lot of confusion, as I've seen that happen a lot. So it's good to kind of name things um, as desired for the end product, right? Initially, when you're kind of identifying reuse components and documenting these components. You'll want your components to be modular. So in the example that we saw here, say, for example, these components that are identified in the right sidebar. So these need to be independent of each other. You don't want to have like the first two components here within a given within a particular wrapper, and the next two components again within another wrapper. You don't want that kind of nesting. Ideally, you just want to have a single placeholder here as much as possible, and then just drop components one below the other without any interdependencies. Now, it's a good idea to use templating engines from front-end perspective. So in this case, you'll also be building the components as blocks and kind of putting the page together by putting together a bunch of blocks in the given design required. So this is eventually what SItecore developers do as well. So it's a good idea. Front-end teams are also working with the same kind of format. It helps in eventually in kind of putting things together in SItecore. Keep in mind that the component might appear multiple times on a given page, possibly with different content. So in this, your code as such, and especially if you have components like carousels and sliders, which need to be instantiated in your JavaScript, so make sure all of that works, even if the component appears multiple times on a page. You would want to address design inconsistencies right off the bat. So this is primarily the responsibility of the front-end team. Frankly speaking, 10-20 pixel here and there is a back-end dev, we don't even notice it. But front-end team, since this is your focus, this is something that you notice. So when you get a list of reused components, so that is when you kind of have to think about things and identify and address any of these design inconsistencies. Something to keep in mind is that a component can be used within its given placeholder, and yes, we can add constraints so that components are tied to certain placeholders and can be used only in certain placeholders. That being said, a component can be used within its placeholder on any page and in any position within that placeholder. So you need to account for that. And if you see any inconsistencies which will not allow for smoothly using it in this way, then that needs to be raised. You can either regroup with the UX, and small things can usually be resolved even by just discussion with the UX. So we fret so much over 510 pixel, and sometimes when we go back to the UX, they're like, hey, just make it equal. That's fine. So that helps with a lot, avoiding a lot of heartache from our side as well. So either regroup with the UX, and in case it is really important and the inconsistency does need to be there. So again, I'm talking about things like, which is important in the design. Say you have the same component, but with different background colors on different pages. So that's not something you want to tell the design team to change. So that is something that can be accounted from our end. And again, you would want to address it using rendering parameters and by toggle of a class and stuff like that, what we discussed for page layouts. So, and the same thing, ideally you would want to document it in your code on the component level itself, so it will make it easier for the backend developers too. Page specific markup is a complete no-no. So, but the good idea, rather the good thing here is that if we have followed everything that we've spoken about before, as in identified reuse initially, and modular components have been followed and address the design inconsistencies effectively, so this is not going to come up at all in this case. An example I'd like to talk of here is in one of our projects we had in the design of the search results page, everything was just a little off only in the search results page. So it's very tempting from a front-end perspective to just stick a search results class on the body tag or something like that and style for all these inconsistencies. But that's really, it's definitely not a good practice, because in that case, you're adding dependencies and your components are not exactly modular. And you do not want to have that kind of dependency. So ideally, if you do have this kind of inconsistency, which you need to account for, you would want to add something on a layout level or on the component levels itself. I would rather add these inconsistencies on every single component in rather than trying to figure out how to add a page specific class, which is definitely not a good idea. So next we're going to talk about some of the common fields available in SItecore and how what's a ideal way to deal with them as such, the simple ones. So as far as links go, out of the box they are rendered as anchor tags. So you would want to use anchor tags especially for redirect links as opposed to using buttons, which you could use for elements that act as switches, and you would probably be controlling them from JavaScript. Try to avoid using unnecessary inner HTML in anchor tags. So if you're just trying to style text and stuff like that, try to do that based on classes on anchor tags itself, as opposed to adding additional inner tags. It can be done, and obviously sometimes it is necessary to add inner tags, and it just makes it a little bit more it's not technically out of the box. So there's like additional stuff that we are doing from the backend to support that. So if it's not really necessary and you're just adding a span tag to probably style the link text, try to avoid that. For images, out of the box, it's obviously rendered as IMG tags. Try to favor IMG tags over background images. The image URLs must be in the markup, especially if you want them content managed. So that's an obvious thing as well. One example that I'd like to mention here is a lot of the sites in the footer, we have these social icons. And from a front-end perspective, I've seen the inclination to kind of go with sprites and output those from the CSS for these social icons. And on a business side, there would be a requirement where we want the content author to be able to add new icons or change the icons and stuff like that, do things like that from their end as well. So if that is managed in CSS, it makes it impossible for us to kind of meet that business requirement, and we end up having back and forth, going back to the front end team, telling them, no, don't put it in the sprite and give me the icons, give me the images and stuff like that. So it's a good idea that whenever you're hard coding anything or putting anything in the CSS, or the images and icons and stuff coming from CSS, it's a good idea to make sure that go back to the requirements or the backend team and kind of make sure that these don't need to be content managed. If that is done proactively, it helps saving some additional collaboration time. Now, rich text fields. It's a very robust field which is available in SItecore, and it's sort of a boon and a curse. It does provide the flexibility to add any formatted text, formatted content. But on the flip side, if you have a content author who knows CSS, it might be very tempting for them to write full-on CSS, and it also gives them the ability to break the design. So this is something that you need to keep in mind. Any content which is being output as from a rich text field, and a good example of this would be your page content or the page body itself. Every page is going to have a page body, so that's usually in rich text, because you want the content author to have the ability to add things like lists, unordered or ordered, and then images and links and stuff like that, and or tables and whatever. So they should have the ability in that case to add formatted content. So as front-end developers, you still need to style these things. So the best way ideally would be to have a common outer tag or a class and you hand this off to the backend developer, and they make sure that whenever a rich text field content is being output, it is wrapped around with this class that you have set, and you would style all the inner formatted content based on this one outer class. And the inner HTML as such would be the simplest possible HTML, because this is something which is in control of the content author. So you don't want to make it complicated with a whole lot of custom classes and stuff like that, because that's not something you can expect the content author to remember. And if they remove it by mistake while editing, then that styling is just lost. So that is something you'd like to keep, you'd want to keep in mind. And as in not having any custom classes of any sort if possible within the inner rich text. This being said, again, it's not always possible. Sometimes you have really complex formatted content, and there are some ways of gracefully working around this from a SItecore perspective. Two of these being custom classes and snippets. So as a backend developer, we have the ability to configure certain custom classes which will appear as options in the rich text editor, and a content author can simply select that class and they don't have to remember and memorize it. So, and it's not about typing the class itself, so they can just click on a class and it would show up. It would, that would show up on the rich text content as such. And this is been especially useful in when in situations where we need to style links. So you might have a set of different button styles or something in your project. So you've given a set of different classes, and using those classes, it's any link can be styled within the rich text to adhere to your designs. So that is a good example of using custom classes. And we also have the provision of configuring HTML snippets. So in that case, if there is a block of, say, really complicated formatted content, so that can be configured as a custom snippet. And the content author can simply go, so on the right side that you see here, they can simply go and select from a list of snippets that we have configured, and that is directly going to be placed into the rich text field here. They can obviously edit the content there because it's going to have some text content, but the entire snippet along with the HTML and the classes and stuff like that is just going to come on the rich text editor. So these are the two things that as a backend developer we can do very easily with just configurations without writing a single line of code. So that's a good thing to know as a front-end developer, because obviously you want to know the kind of things that we can do easily, or rather the system is capable of, without writing any additional customizations. So this is something you can account for while you're doing the front end for formatted content as well. The last thing here to be aware of is beware of p tags. So just to kind of give you a heads up, and just something that you need to be aware of. So when a content author is editing content in a rich text editor, hitting enter basically creates new paragraphs and wraps it around with p tags. So while editing content, you might always see additional p tags here and there all over the place. So make sure you account for that when you do your styling, and you definitely don't want to wrap your rich text around around p tags, because you don't want nesting in that way. So it's just something to be aware of. The next thing we're going to speak about is experience editor. So experience editor mode is a view available in SItecore where the content authors are able to edit the content inline on the page itself. So to support for this kind of editing, there is additional generated markup, and there's additional CSS and JS on the page, which allows inline editing. So as front-end developers, you need to make sure you avoid position-based selectors in CSS and JS, because that kind of stuff is not going to work here with all the additional markup. If you're using jQuery in your project, it's highly recommended that you use no conflict to avoid framework clashes. Use closures and wraps in your code in excuse me, in self-invoking functions. Something I'd like to talk about here is sliders and carousels. So when you have sliders and carousels on your page, it might make it a little difficult to edit this content inline. So if you have a slider, trying to edit the content of each slide in the experience editor mode sometimes is not as straightforward as expected. So there is another way to go here, and which is something that I've seen a lot of experienced front-end teams doing, that is separating the editing and the preview functionality. So SItecore does have a preview mode where you can go and preview your saved content without having to publish it and without having to deal with the additional markup and CSS and JS generated in Experience Editor mode. So good idea here would be, and how you would kind of go about this is that you ask your backend team to output a class on your body tag, on your body tag, to signify whether a page is being loaded in Experience Editor mode. And what, as a front-end developer, what you would do is you would initialize these controls, say sliders or carousels, only if the page is loading in rather if it is not loading in Experience Editor mode. So when you view the page in Experience Editor mode, your sliders ideally would just show up as, slides one below the other. It would not be a slider as such. It would just show up as content one below the other. So in that case, it would make it really easy to edit this content as a content editor. But and if you wanted to preview it, you would have to go into the switch to the preview mode and see what it looks like, what it would look like. So this can be a little controversial because I'm saying it's a WYSIWYG editor, and then I'm asking you to kind of split out the editing and the previewing. But it's just a good thing to know. Sometimes it gets really complicated in trying to make everything editable in Experience Editor mode, especially if you have a JavaScript heavy site. So you need to kind of weigh if it is worth the trouble that you're taking to make everything editable in Experience Editor mode, and as opposed to asking the content author to just go and look at the preview mode and use the Experience Editor plain and simple just for editing content. It's just a way to go that I'd like to mention here, and I've seen a lot of teams actually doing this. If you're able to convince your client and your content authors to do this, nothing like it. It makes your life a lot simpler, and it also, in fact, gives you the ability to make a lot more content Experience Editor friendly, because you can output stuff in Experience Editor mode solely for the purpose of editing fields, as opposed to just outputting what is there in the design. So it really helps a lot. It gives you a lot of flexibility to make your entire content or all your content Experience Editor friendly. So something to think about. Something, if it's acceptable, it's definitely a good way to go. Next thing I'd like to talk about is API integration and jQuery AJAX calls. So in your based on the components that you have, you will definitely have things come across stuff like listings and search with paginations, filters, and faceting and stuff like that. So this is one of the places where I think most of the collaboration time, or a lot of the collaboration time, can be saved if this is handled well and in right off the bat initially by the front-end team themselves. So you might have all these pages where a lot of front-end interaction is required to show the data on the page. Now you can go about this two ways. In the first way, what you would do is the data that is required for this front-end interaction would be present on the page itself, and it would be just loaded up in the markup, possibly as a data attribute on some tag as fixed JSON. So if you have less amount of data, this is actually a good way to do things, because it's not everything that you need is directly loaded up on the page on load, and front-end interactions will be super quick and super easy, and you just need to manipulate your front-end based on the data which is already on the page. But if you have more data, or you have the potential of having more data, so that is when you'd want to use APIs. So in either case, whether you're going with data in the markup or with APIs, it's a good idea for front end to fix the JSON structure that they need the data in right off the bat. So either you put in the sample JSON that you need on the markup, if that's the way you're going, or you can use hosting options like Apiary, which allows you to host mock APIs and returns the sample JSON that you code in there. So you can use that option as well if you're going the API route. And what you'll want to do is store the API URL within your markup. So as a SItecore developer, when I get the the final assets, the HTML from you, so then I would have this sample JSON in the markup as a part of the markup, which I know that I need to generate and place in this particular location on page load, or I need to create an API which returns the exact same format of JSON that your mock API is returning. And I just need to replace the mock API URL with the URL that I've developed. Now, ideally, if this is done as expected, and that's what I've seen happening in experienced teams, who are like work like a well-oiled machine. So if this is all happening as expected, it really helps in reducing a lot of collaboration time, because otherwise it's like front end does its thing and then moves on to other components, and then back end comes in after like a sprint or something, and then we're like, okay, we write our API and then again hand it off to front end. They have to jump off of things they're already working on and come back and do the jQuery, the front end integration and stuff like that. So that is something that is really avoidable and helps saving in a lot of time. So this is something that I would really say that you should invest in to start with, because this is something that really helps a lot. So the last thing I'd like to talk about is SItecore Forms. So SItecore Forms is a plugin, sort of a plugin within SItecore, which allows the content authors to build forms on the fly and drop them onto pages without needing any developer effort. So the decision on whether SItecore Forms is to be used or not is usually done based on the designs by the business analyst or the tech arc themselves. So because these forms are being built in SItecore and the markup is being generated in SItecore, so we don't really have complete control over or we don't have much control over the markup that is being generated for these forms. So this is the main reason why a call has to be made whether to use SItecore Forms or not. So based on your designs, if it is somewhat okay to kind of change things, or if, change the look and feel a little bit, or adjust with the look and feel, and it's not as complex, and is something that SItecore Forms does evolve day after day. So there's a lot of things that SItecore Forms does support. So based on the designs and the feasibility, it's usually a decision is taken whether to use SItecore Forms or not. So as a front-end developer, when you receive designs of a page with forms, obviously the first question you should be asking is whether you're using SItecore Forms or not. Because if SItecore Forms is being used, in that case, you would want to work around the generated HTML of the forms and try and design them as closely as possible to, or try and style them as closely as possible to the designs, as opposed to building the form itself, building the form HTML itself, because it's harder to try and work around custom HTML and trying to put it in the SItecore Forms box where it usually does not fit. So it's a much harder process if you're going about it that way. So it's a much better idea to kind of upfront figure out, okay, if SItecore Forms is being used or not. In case it's being used, a good idea would be to request your backend team to generate a test form for you and drop it onto a test page with all the fields possible. And ideally, you would want to style things or work around that generated HTML as much as possible and style things as per your design. So that I have found is a good way of kind of working around SItecore Forms. You would also want to keep in mind that validations is also something that can be added in SItecore Forms itself. So you would not want to write your own custom validations, but you would have to work around styling the validation messages and errors that are generated from SItecore Forms itself when you manage such validations in the form in SItecore. So yeah, I think that's all I had. In case you have any questions or you have anything else to add in here based on your experience, the floor is open. Thank you so much.